Hey friends, welcome to today's Transforming Chaplaincy webinar. We are so glad that you are here among us and chose to spend some of your important time with us today. I am going to get us started here. So welcome officially to Mental Health Clinical Pastoral Education, a specialized CPE program. If you're on social media, if you hang out in any chaplaincy office, you are well aware that it's Happy Spiritual Care Week. Well, I hope it's a Happy Spiritual Care Week. So officially from Transforming Chaplaincy, we want to extend that to you as well. And that's a part of the reason we are here today hosting this event. Today's event is the second of a three-part trifecta related to marking these 100 years since Boysen started CPE. And next month, we are so glad to see Reverend Dr. Lori Swan. She'll be presenting on spiritual care in public mental health hospitals. And if you're not familiar with our webinars here in the beginning, we try to just do a little marketing pieces. So if you have a smartphone and want to take some quick notes that way and get some links, we look forward to that. Again, this event is free as well. And we're glad to be sponsoring that with our friends at ACPE. Next week is the last day to register for this first ever Healthcare Chaplaincy State of the Science that we hosted back in June in my home state in Minnesota, but we'll be hosting it online. And proud to say that I think there's over 140 sites that have registered for this already. So I'm excited that people are excited for this. And bonus is you get all of your research CEUs done in one fell swoop. I also want to mention something that's close to my heart. I get to serve as the lead for this clinical note writing. It's what I'm doing my PhD work on. So we got a few spots left. If you're interested in that, we'll be hosting that next month with some outstanding faculty colleagues that are a part of that. Speaking of outstanding colleagues, I'm so glad to have with us Jasmine Okafor from ACPE, and I'm going to introduce her, and then she's going to introduce our speaker and respondent for today. So Jasmine, I'm taking a deep breath here on this because you do some good stuff. She brings over a decade of nonprofit executive leadership with a career that integrates ministry, community work, and social entrepreneurship. Jasmine serves as ACPE's Director of Development and DEI Initiatives, where she leads the organization's fundraising strategy and its JEDEI Grants Initiative. You're going to have to correct me on that, which includes the Christopher CEC Ignite Grant, the Innovation in Spiritual Care and Research Grants Program, the Hemingway Scholars Program, the Boysen Scholars Program, and the Mission Advancement Program, all designed to expand equity and inclusion and support innovative psychotherapy and spiritual care initiatives. And Jasmine, I get to be in the ACPE Research Committee with you. I guess, man, you can't list everything, but you must be bilocated. I know you get this all done. Additionally, Jasmine bridges philanthropic support with mission-driven impact, cultivating partnerships and resources that strengthen ACPE's community of scholars, educators, and practitioners. Jasmine, so great to have you here. On behalf of ACPE, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul, and it's so much fun working with you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that you all are joining us today. As Paul said, I bring greetings on behalf of ACPE and just a lot of gratitude as we join Transforming Chaplaincy for today's conversation on mental health CPE. So, most of you may know a little bit about ACPE, but just a brief overview. We are the nation's leading organization for spiritual care education, supporting chaplains, educators, spiritually integrated psychotherapists, and spiritual caregivers through accredited CPE programs, certification, and professional development. We're deeply committed to advancing excellence, inclusion, and research in this vital work, which is why today's conversation is so exciting for us as we celebrate the centennial year of CPE. As Paul mentioned, we're also celebrating Spiritual Care Week this week. And so this dialogue reminds us that spiritual care belongs everywhere people seek healing, including mental health and public health spaces. It is my honor to introduce today's plenary speakers. First, we'll have the Reverend Angelika Zollfrank. Angelika serves as chaplain and ACPE educator with the Spirituality and Mental Health Program at McLean Hospital. She's a published author and researcher and her manuscript actually helped inspire today's event. As convener of Transforming Chaplaincy's Chaplaincy and Mental Health Care Group, Angelika continues to shape how we understand the intersection of spirituality and mental health. Following Angelika, we will welcome Dr. Brad Unruh. Dr. Unruh is medical director of the Gunderson Residence and an instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. His clinical approach integrates evidence based treatments with general psychiatric management. His publications explore topics from medical ethics to to the philosophy of psychiatry, and he brings a deep interest in the spiritual dimensions of the human experience. Wow. Together, they'll guide us in exploring how chaplaincy can transform mental health care. So please join me in welcoming wonderful colleagues, Reverend Zal Frank and Dr. Unruh.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Jasmine. And Paul, I cannot see the slides yet.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled to be here,
Yeah.
and happy Spiritual Care Week to everybody. You are all doing amazing work wherever you are, and I'm thinking that many of you might be in hospitals that also provide spiritual care in behavioral health.
Give me 2 seconds here, Angelika.
Sure.
And go ahead.
Well, I can just start. And we'll start by telling you that today we are honoring Anton Boysen's legacy. And his legacy is really mental health clinical pastoral education, because the first CPE program started in 1925, exactly 100 years ago, in Worcester State Hospital. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. Next slide, please. This is the paper that I was able to publish together with David Rosmarin and Carolyn Kaufman on the mental health clinical pastoral education program here at McLean Hospital. And you can read it in the Journal of Religions. It's open access. Next slide, please. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about Anton Boysen's vision for clinical pastoral education and the intersection of spirituality and mental health, why mental health CPE remains scarce and is actually urgently needed. And then also I will talk a little bit about our program here at McLean Hospital with some responses from participants. Next slide, please. So religious and spiritual leaders, clergy, are first responders. So it really matters that clergy, chaplains, religious and spiritual leaders are trained in mental health chaplaincy. Usually, people in this field of work meet at least one suicidal person annually, but many do not feel equipped to respond. And that's suicide. There are other problems, of course, like psychosis or religious spiritual delusions or other phenomena that people don't feel like they're equipped to offer support in. And then also, the research tells us that even fewer than half of clergy make referrals to mental health professionals. Next slide, please. So most chaplains actually have no specialized training in mental health chaplaincy. In my own training, I received 1 or 2 didactics in mental health chaplaincy, or just an overview over the psychopathology. And I would assume that this is still very much the case across the country. Next, please. Could you forward the slide, please? So in the religious and spiritual communities, we know that the relationship between spirituality, religion, and mental health is quite complex. So we know there's positive effects. For example, we know that adolescents and young people have less of a likelihood to become addicted to alcohol and substances if they grow up in a religious or spiritual community. We know that there is a benefit to attending religious organizations, group gatherings, and that it actually prolongs life. We know that there's a community connection that's really important, meaning and purpose is important. But we also know that there are some negative effects as well. In religious communities, oftentimes there's a marginalization of people who are struggling with severe mental health problems. There's a pressure to conform to what it looks like to be together as a religious community. And throughout the throughout the religious communities, there's also stigmatizing beliefs or theologies that come up. If you just had prayed more, you would not be depressed. If you had more faith and would nurture that faith through reading the Bible, you wouldn't be quite so confused. And many people also have punishing appraisals. There's also an entire body of research about the harmful effects of spiritual abuse or experiences that are negative that people have experienced in the church or in other religious communities. Next slide, please. So with all of this, here's Anton Boysen. He was a psychiatric survivor himself, and some call him a mad prophet. And of course, the two things that he's most known for is the clinical pastoral education program that he started in 1925, and his focus on studying the living human document. So for us as chaplains to study the person we're meeting with the same seriousness, respect, and willingness to learn that we also apply in the studies of religious text. Next slide, please. So Boysen had what we call today lived experience. He had 3 lifetime hospitalizations for psychosis, and he was diagnosed with dementia precox, which at the time was a term that had the connotation that there really is an organic problem with the brain. So the treatment was sedatives, hydrotherapy, beatings, and restraints. The office that I am sitting in right now has little marble tiles on the outside, which to me probably signals that at some point people were treated here for with hydrotherapy. He had his break with reality when he was revising his theological statement for his ordination in the Presbyterian Church. He recognized what was going on with him as delusion, and yet he insisted that it had purpose and that it was ultimately spiritually transformative. Next slide. So he had a revolutionary vision, and 5 years after his hospitalization, Boysen became the chaplain at Worcester State Hospital, where he himself had been a patient. So in the world of psychiatry, we talk about this as lived experience, as peers who have experience that they can share in terms of learning the the person who's actually going through serious mental illness. In some ways, Boysen was patient-centered and recovery-oriented, two very important catchphrases for us in the world of psychiatry right now. And he was deeply interested in the scientific study of spirituality, religion, and mental health. Interestingly enough, he had been at the School of Forestry at Yale, and so he applied those research methods to his field of religion, spirituality, and psychiatry. And he was very interested in using the therapeutics of religion in the treatment of mental illness. Next slide, please. So I had to chuckle because Boysen is interested in bringing theologues into encounter with suffering persons, and mainly to avoid two errors. He felt that religious conservatives offer treatment without diagnosing the problems that people are struggling with. And he also felt that his liberal friends fell short and that they offered neither treatment nor diagnosis, and therefore um, had the problem of potentially becoming irrelevant. He noted that mental illness is the price to pay for being human, and that we have choice and capacity for growth, which he himself was very interested in and had experienced. Next slide, please. So Boysen's enduring legacy is that he wanted to break down the wall between medicine and religion, but ultimately also he wanted to change religious communities and bring about social change and make these communities relevant for what was important to people. He believed in the fellowship of the best. Throughout his life, he had very significant relationships with a number of key people who were with him through the decades and through his repeated psychotic breaks. And he felt supported by them, but also challenged. And the Fellowship of the Best became the model for the CPE uh, peer group that he created, where there would be challenge as well as support. He was quite well versed in the art of psychiatric diagnosis as it existed then, one has to add, and he saw mental illness as a part of human growth. And he transcended denominational boundaries, which at the time in 1925 was still relatively unusual. Next slide, please. Now, we know that CPE has some positive outcomes, and maybe some of you have seen the very recent paper by David Fleener on chaplains reporting on the first years, in the first years of their chaplaincy career on their CPE formation. Next slide, please. So mental health CPE is actually really scarce in the US. There are, to my knowledge, 2 or 3 other programs in the country. And of course, I'm wondering, why is this so? There are so many more programs in medical hospitals. Well, in part, there are not quite as many psychiatric facilities, but maybe there are many more than we actually would consider. So why is this the case, that there is no mental health CPE training in every town and in every major city? Well, partially because Freud thought that religion was an illusion that needed to be replaced by reason. Partially because psychiatry is stigmatizing religion while the religious groups stigmatize mental illness. There is still it's still hard to find a biomedical, social, spiritual model of care in any of the major areas. I would say possibly palliative care is one of those places where it's different, and maybe pediatrics as well. But then there were also historical factors. Some of the benefactors and supporters of Boysen actually stopped supporting him once they heard that he had a second and third psychotic episodes. And ultimately, that led to a marginalization of spiritual meaning making in mental health care. Next slide, please. So at McLean, since 2015, we have the Spirituality Mental Health Program. This is after a long hiatus. The last chaplain left McLean, or was left in 94, and the CPE program was accredited in 21-24. We currently have 31 graduates. Next slide, please. So this is David Rosmarin, who is really to be credited for starting the spirituality and mental health program. He walked around with a yarmulke here at the hospital, and people would search him out and seek him out and say, "You are religious. I can talk with you about spirituality." And he was able to identify the gap. So our program has the four pillars, or is connected to the four pillars of the mission of the organization: research, clinical care, education, and community outreach. And we're really trying to integrate spirituality into evidence psychiatric practice. David is working with clinicians mainly, and CPE chaplaincy comes in from the religious side. Next slide, please. So the goals of CPE are not that different from other CPE programs. So we can probably move forward here. Next slide, please. The program structure is also very similar. We are maybe a bit heavier on the educational hours, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about our hospital. So we have 15 inpatient psychiatric units, and students are placed on 11 of those. We also have several residential programs. So in addition to the units here, there is a residential program for psychotic disorders as well. There's a program for first responders, armed forces, and EMTs. And we actually have four psychosis disorder units, two mood and anxiety disorder units, and just to say too, that of course in those inpatient units, people often have 3 or 4 psychiatric disorders, or also struggle with personality disorders, which is another program I should mention. There's a residential and outpatient program for personality disorders, which Brandon Unruh heads up, and I'm very lucky to work with him. Next slide, please. So the unique elements in our program, obviously there needs to be education in trauma-informed care and safety protocols. So I learned the hard way, I will say, that students need to be briefed on the etiquette on a psychiatric unit before going there. We integrate the students into the interprofessional team. They are required to attend rounds and meet with peer specialists, and multi-professional collaboration is a part of what we do. It's not unusual, actually, with some psychiatrists that we start a team meeting with a patient with prayer, because that is important to that patient and may lead to acceptance of medication. Students are also exposed to neurotherapeutic interventions, so they have an opportunity to observe ECT, and that mainly serves the purpose of destigmatizing psychiatric illnesses, also to see them as brain disorders. We have the Harvard Brain Bank here at McLean, and often students also get a tour there, which is very helpful to understand that there's really so little that we know about so many of the disorders that we're treating. Of course, we have specialized didactics, but I think the main learning for students is the leadership of spirituality groups. And we have two kinds of groups that students get to lead after an extensive orientation. And it really is an opportunity for students to claim their authority to run a spirituality group that has a therapeutic goal and is structured in such a way that it is seen as treatment of psychiatric illness. And one of my students, who was a Roman Catholic priest, said this was probably the best leadership training I received in my entire formation. And I personally find it so important for students, because they do 4 groups in a row on a Sunday afternoon and have a chance to use the same protocol in 4 different areas to learn about the different illnesses and the different populations. Next slide, please. So I do find, as probably many of you, that CPE offers transformational learning. And, we can look at those 5 different areas as we go forward. Please, the next slide. So the first change, of course, is growing confidence. Initially, people come with a great deal of anxiety to a psychiatric hospital. One of my students said, I told my mother that I'm doing my CPE over the summer in a psychiatric unit or in a psychiatric hospital, and she started crying. So that tells me something about the stigma that is still out in the world. And yeah, confidence is one of the most important aspects. Next slide, please. There is a deepening empathy that comes about as students are beginning to shift from helping a mentally ill person to exploring their own psychological landscape. And I can always wait for the moment where students come back to the office and I see it in their face that they really understood what it means to struggle with a severe mental illness. And oftentimes they come back and they say, this could be me. This could be me. Next slide, please. There's, of course, skills and competencies. I want to say that the spiritual assessment tool that I find most helpful in this environment is the 7x7 by George Fitchett, of course. And students need to learn semi-structured interviewing. They need to learn how to interrupt, how to redirect, and how to, in a way, guide the conversation to a more helpful place. Next slide, please. Students confront the complexities of their own minds and they begin to self-differentiate after that time where they're like, oh my God, this could be me. And maybe I'm personality disordered. Maybe I have clinical depression. Maybe I am sometimes experiencing things spiritually that could be identified as clinical phenomena. So then there's the second, this new phase where students begin to self-differentiate and find their own um, grounding again. And they may have their own experiences with mental illness or may have had family members, of course, who have struggled with it. Next slide, please. There is in every unit, as far as I can tell, somewhat of a spiritual or educational crisis where students encounter deep helplessness and powerlessness. Of course, this is true in an oncology ward as well. But I think in mental health settings, it's a slightly different experience because it is one's own mind that is affected. Sometimes students will return to the office and speak about how disorganized they feel or how deeply sad they come away from the day, or how they find it quite invigorating to be with someone who is maybe manic. So ultimately, through this crucible, there is a different curiosity, compassion, and a clarification of faith. One of my students put it very simply. She said, if these people can have hope, then who am I not to? Who am I not to have hope? Next slide, please. So there is an impact beyond the CPE program. Students are starting mental health ministries in religious and spiritual communities that may be support groups, grief groups. They feel like they're through the leadership experiences in inpatient psychiatric units, they're much more able to take leadership in meetings in the congregations. They have a clarified role and they really live out Boysen's vision for a changed landscape of religious and spiritual communities. and reduce stigma, which is so important. Next slide, please. So what can you do today? Recognize your role as a spiritual first responder, both within the hospital as well as outside of the hospital. Then develop reciprocal relationships for referrals between mental health providers. It's probably a growing edge on both sides of the professions. Address stigmatizing spiritual beliefs in your communities. It is so important to talk about that, preach about it, discuss it. Learn mental health literacy, basic skills and how spiritual assessment plays into it. Consider specialized training and mental health CPE, particularly if you do have a significant psychiatric population in your hospital, and create communities that utilize spirituality and religion for mental wellness. Next slide, please. So I feel that there is a great urgency in our moment right now. Since COVID, the suicide rates continue to rise. There is a mental health crisis that is increasing. I think the introduction of AI to the workplace and to the world and the growing use of social media is not going to stop that, but rather exacerbate it. And the spiritual hunger is just incredible, and I see it every day in the hospital. So it's really time to act, and there's an opportunity for spiritual and religious leaders because people have access to spiritual religious leaders, whereas sometimes it is very difficult to find a therapist or to afford one. And not that that's something to bemoan. It's a part of what spiritual religious leaders then have to responsibly handle and develop resources to help people. How can they access mental health resources if they need it? And communities can become sources of healing. There's not a day that doesn't go by where one of our teams will ask me, can you connect this person with a religious or spiritual community? They really need community. And that those places can be places of healing. And then, of course, specialized training is available. Next slide, please. So we continue Boysen's legacy of breaking an opening into the wall which separated medicine and religion. And I hope you join us in this mission as we go forward. So I think the next piece would be Brandon's response, and we can get to questions later, but I hope that, and I can also put my email in the chat so that people can email me if you have any questions. I'm happy to connect with you.
Thank you, Angelika. Before we transition to Dr. Unruh, I just want to mention to all of you friends, please do use the chat, and we'd love to hear your comments for that. And then also, please, if you have a question, I encourage you to use the Q&A because it puts it into a queue and doesn't get buried in a chat in case that is happening. So again, so many props to you, Angelika. It's fun to hear a colleague that you know in meetings, but to see your expertise shine is a lot of fun. The other thing I want to give you some serious applause for is, friends, the reason why I was advancing the slides was because at the last minute, Angelika got bumped out of her system and had to jump on a new computer. So you did that seamlessly and with lots of panache. So thanks so much for what you offered and for doing it with style. So thanks again. And Dr. Unruh, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I have to say it's an honor and really an inspired joy to be with you this Spiritual Care Week and to take part in a transforming chaplaincy event. And I was thinking the title of Angelika's presentation might as well have been Transforming a Hospital, because, you know, with no sort of intent to overstate it here, that is exactly what I've seen her CPE program due at McLean Hospital over the last few years. And I've been here at the hospital a bit longer than she has, so I really can attest to that. It's been transformative personally and professionally for me. So this little discussion I'll provide, hopefully it's pitched appropriately for everybody here, but it's really a culmination and a really rewarding friendship and professional partnership that the two of us have had. So thank you, Angelika, for this. My takeaway message in my brief discussion, and I'll keep it brief because we want to hear from all of you, of course. The takeaway message is that all parties involved, chaplains, mental health clinicians, treatment systems, and most importantly, the individuals we're all there to serve, all parties profoundly benefit from the exposures and teaching and training experiences that can be embedded within a specialized mental health chaplaincy program. That's been my experience as an onlooker and someone who tries to support as best I can as a clinician these activities that Angelika has spearheaded. I would like to briefly use the patient population that I serve of people with what we call personality disorders and the program that I serve, which is only one little corner of the hospital in which Angelika works, as an example to showcase how chaplains equipped with special mental health awareness and familiarity with some clinical techniques that we use to treat specific mental health problems can have multi-layered, powerful, and truly unique effects on an entire treatment system and milieu, including the patients, the clinical care team, the wider fields that both chaplains and mental health clinicians are working in, and it just extends far and wide from there in my experience. So the program where I serve is called the Gunderson Residence, and that's an integrative residential treatment program for patients with so-called personality disorders. And I say so-called because that is the term by which we call this diagnosis. As many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the DSM construct of personality disorder. But whenever we're talking about personality functioning and personality, we're in the realm, I would say, of experiences which need to have a psychological and spiritual formulation as well as a psychiatric formulation. This is an area that just calls for chaplaincy work, I think, in a special way. And yes, of course, I'm biased because this is the population I work with and serve. But we could probably pick other populations as well, but I'm just going to go with the example here. So in this case, just consider this picture. In this case, it's Angelika herself sitting next to me as a clinician in a weekly Sacred Stories group that operates every week on Wednesday mornings at the Gunderson Residence, in which we are inviting our patients to consider, and these are patients that are with us for months at a time, but to consider reading sacred stories from a wide variety of spiritual and religious and secular traditions. And it's a meaning-making group. And this is a group that actually Angelika pioneered and developed this format. I have zero credit I could take for this. I wish. But Angelika has come into our program as both a consultative presence and I would say a regular therapeutic clinical presence, a spiritual presence to lead this group. And this group, as I said, is focused on meaning making. Now, this, again, if you think about this patient population, personality disorder is a complex and still very stigmatized mental illness. And there are a lot of stigma that are perpetuated by misinformation, maybe even more true in this area than in some other areas of mental health awareness and destigmatization, where there has been more public advocacy and destigmatization processes. But our patients tend to be seen as resistant to getting better, seeking to thwart progress and change, intent on, sort of thwarting the intentions of benevolent treaters, attention-seeking, fragile, weak people. There's all kinds of stigma about this. But this is where, for chaplains seeking to work with this increasingly common presenting problem in mental health systems, by this way, this personality disorder makes up for probably about a quarter of the inpatient presentations to the hospital. I could give good stats on that, but I'll spare you that for now. But knowing and understanding some of the core symptoms of borderline personality disorder, as one is approaching these individuals as a chaplain, understanding the core symptoms and experiences at a deeper level can really galvanize improved understanding and empathy and reflection together about the intersection between spirituality and psychopathology or psychiatric symptoms. For example, our patients with borderline personality disorder will come to us with problems that, to my ears, sound like they must have a spiritual core at some level. So, for example, Angelika mentioned the crisis in suicidality. We know that actually a lot of that crisis actually is linked with personality disorder. For people who are recurrently suicidal and self-harming throughout their lives, particularly when those shifts into suicidality and self-harm are embedded within interpersonal disruptions or disruptions within sense of self, we actually know that personality functioning is a really helpful lens for understanding and empathizing with what could drive people to these experiences. So if you take someone who comes to a program like ours, this is almost every patient in our case, reporting a history of extreme suicidality. Often they're lucky to be alive, blessed to be alive, we would say. And in some sense, it almost seems like should not have survived, some of the attempts that have been made in the past. We might immediately sort of think of these behaviors at an existential level. That there's hopelessness here. There's spiritual seeking and desert and a sense of yearning. We want to interact with these experiences on that level, as we should with a spiritual formulation. But we also need to know that the particular patterns of suicidality and self-harm that we often see in people with borderline personality disorder are highly linked with particular attachment styles. And sometimes those behaviors and symptoms can function primarily as interpersonal communication that elicits certain responses that we can understand if we apply certain clinical frameworks that we do as clinicians to understanding borderline personality disorder. And I won't go through all those various frameworks now, but my point is that there are these helpful clinical frameworks which might help us for those of you that are, all of you, really, I imagine, that are chaplains, there's an enhancement to a chaplain's approach that I've seen as a clinician. For chaplains that actually become familiar with some of how we approach and understand and treat some of these problems using some of these clinical perspectives. Angelika mentioned punishing God appraisals in one of her slides. And if you're a chaplain and approaching, how to work with a patient with borderline personality disorder, who tend to be more likely to have these punishing God appraisals. That's been demonstrated in a variety of studies. It would be really helpful, I think, to know that actually there are more punishing self and other appraisals in general in borderline personality disorder. And the kind of self-hatred or what can be experienced as hatefulness or aggression towards others and self, that has links to a temperament with heightened aggression. And it has links to some of the empirical studies. The things that we know about people with borderline personality disorder is that they're much more likely to report these aggressive feelings and thoughts about themselves and others. So we're at this gray area and this really complex, nuanced interface between what do we consider psychiatric or psychological that's not psychiatric, or spiritual, or both, or all of the above. And as a clinician who wants to be working from biopsychosocial spiritual formulation, who cares about spiritual experience, I can't tell you how helpful it is when I'm working with a chaplain like Angelika, who actually not only has this robust experience of how to work with people around spiritual and religious parts of their experience, but also actually knows something about borderline personality disorder, or how spiritual bypass, for example, is important for narcissistic patients who are organized that way, who may recruit certain aspects of spirituality in a rather calcified or overly rigid or compartmentalized way, or kind of a premature flight from actually sitting with the nuances or the pain of an experience. And it can actually look like that's quite spiritual on the surface, but actually in a way it's really helpful to know something psychiatrically about how a person with narcissistic personality disorder has at the core a real deep self-esteem instability. And part of the regulation of that self-esteem might look sometimes like this kind of rigid or premature flight into spiritual concepts, or spiritual practices might function in part to manage that vulnerable self-esteem, sometimes in unhealthy ways, actually. So even just to begin to have these kind of conversations with patients and just to begin to conceptualize a clinical case, around these kind of presenting symptoms, how can we do it as clinicians without chaplains? And I would say, if I could be so bold, how could one do it as a chaplain without understanding something a bit more specific about personality functioning? So that's one of many examples we could talk about, but I think my time is already up, and I want to stop there and leave plenty of time for discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Unruh, and Angelika, so much. And yeah, let's, I don't know if you see some of that. Jasmine, I don't know if you are available too, but I know you've probably seen in the chat some of the Q&A, some of the,
Yeah, yeah. So, can I be heard? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So in terms of recruitment, how do I think differently about recruitment in this particular setting? That was one question. I'm just going to take that right here. I am very much aware that there is a lot to know about mental illnesses and psychiatric illness, as Brandon has just talked about a little bit more for personality disorders, but the same is true for psychotic disorders, for depression and anxiety, for trauma. And people need to know something about those conditions. And so there are two ways of coming by that, either as Boysen did through his own experience, right? And that may, in recruitment of my students, may actually look like them having awareness of the mental illnesses that they have experienced, not themselves, but maybe also in families and among friends. But then also, it's important that they're willing to be curious and willing to read and take in some of the information that is important to take in. So they really need to learn something about the environment. Arguably, that's true in any CPE setting. You probably need to know something about cardiology when you're in a cardiology intensive care unit. But I think in this environment, it's really key because we can do harm. We can do harm. And how do we avoid that? So that's one response there. In terms of recruitment, I'm very passionate about also bringing in first unit CPE students to this environment. And I screen them very carefully. I would not take everybody. And at the same time, my passion is to make sure that people can go back to their religious and spiritual communities. And people who come from less privileged environments or disadvantaged environments may not be able to do more than one unit of CPE. And then they are off to do the pastoring of the church, or they're in their majid or wherever else they're serving. And I want them to have this knowledge, and I want them to transform their spiritual and religious groups. And I want them to be able to work with people who suffer in this way. So, of course, is it easier for me to work with someone who's advanced and knows about CPE? Yes. However, I've also experienced that some advanced students are less curious. So it really depends. And curiosity is the the one thing that I'm most interested in screening when I interview students, because that's something I cannot teach. You either have it or you don't, and so that's very important for me.
Thanks for that, Angelica. I was, or did you have a thought you were finishing?
No, no, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead. Go ahead,
I was
Jasmine.
going to share that in the chat, there's lots of appreciation for you and Dr. Unruh's presentation, and some asks around sharing different materials that helps to strengthen your CPE programs. And so I will encourage those of you who are asking for CPE course outlines and things of that sort to perhaps email Angelika directly. She did include her email in the chat, but there were several questions around those specifics, Angelika.
Yeah.
And
Well,
then there's
I would also just simply refer people to the paper. It's open access; anybody can get it, and there's lots of information about the program in the paper. So I would just refer you there.
Mm. There's an interesting question here, Angelika, about it's from Michelle Stern, and they ask, what kind of assessment do your students
Mhm.
use on the geriatric psych unit?
Mhm.
They work in the elder care program, but most have some level of cognitive impairment.
Mhm.
Um, they find that the 7x7 works for does not quite work for people living with dementia, and wanted
Mhm.
to know your thoughts around that.
Yeah. Maybe what I want to say about that is that on our geriatric units, the majority of patients has lived with psychiatric diagnoses their entire lives. So that may be the dominant reason for why they're hospitalized here in our psychiatric hospital, because that's a specialized expertise that they can't get anywhere else, whereas treatment for dementia or care in that setting may be available in other places. So, you know, we treat a lot of patients who have chronic anxiety or depression, but also have suffered their entire lives of other mental illnesses like obsessive compulsive disorder or a personality disorder, and so those are issues that need to be addressed, and then particularly in the placement and the aftercare, it's complicated. We do have an area where people are less high functioning, if I might put it that way, in terms of dementia and Alzheimer care. And I find in that area, AIM is probably the better assessment tool to use, but spiritual AIM. But I just think I'm I'm struggling to answer the question because I'm so guided by the person in front of me and less by the assessment tool, although of course those are in my head, and we need to ask those questions. So yeah, I think if I may add one more piece, I think the most important question to answer in our, or to pose in our setting, is to ask people openly, do you experience struggle in your spirituality right now? And then to be aware that there's 6 different kinds, and Kenneth Pargament and Judy Exline have written about it, and then to be able to at least sort that and begin to think about what might be some curated um, uh, resources for this or that patient who are suffering from this or that spiritual struggle. Yeah.
Angelica, there's an interesting question in here, which is a good connection between also the ACPE side, but they're a full-time chaplain, I believe a behavioral health chaplain, and they are interested in starting a CPE program for students in the future. And they're curious about what are some of the first steps that they could take. And I'm imagining even before going through some of those more formal program accreditation steps, what might be some of the initial thinking around how this program can support your center that someone may want to take if they are interested in starting a CPE program?
So this is where I'm just forever indebted to David Rosmarin, who has asked our patients and has done the questionnaires to find out that 58% of our inpatient population and residential population do want spirituality to be integrated into their treatment. And we are in the northeast of the US. So in other areas of the country, that will be probably a higher percentage. But if you think about that, 58%, that's every other patient. We have 500 patients here. And we are in operation with myself as chaplain and CPE educator, part-time chaplain and CPE students, and we're working it to meet the need. But I think it's really important to make sure that the accreditation is driven by the patient need rather than by the need for education, which of course is, as I tried to make the case, also very much there.
That's great, Angelika. Thank you for that. Any other final thoughts, or Paul, any other questions that you found here that you want to raise to the panelists? I know we have about 2 more minutes left.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. No, Brandon and Kelly, I loved it. I love the chat that's flowered there. I just would love to hear your riff on this whole, like, is it psychological? Is it emotional? Is it psychiatric? Is it spiritual? Yes, I know is probably the answer, but I don't know if there's somebody who comes to mind that you could de-identify, but I don't really, I know there's time running short, but yeah, please bring your brilliance on that.
Are you asking Brandon specifically now?
Both and.
Both and.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I would go all the way back to the first patient we shared, Brandon, which was a young woman who I met on the unit in which we treat PTSD and personality disorders and dissociative identity disorders. And this young woman's background was Latter-day Saints, and the suicidal ideation was very significant. And I met with her at the time, really still quite naive about personality disorders and the intricacies of the treatment. And I spoke with her about her artwork. And we considered together, this was over several visits, but we considered together whether there is a meaning to her artwork, which initially she denied, which would be expected in a personality disorder, and then began to consider, and we kind of found our way into some of the biblical stories that may have been referenced there or not. And it was a quite pertinent clinical story. And Brandon connected with me. This is maybe the most important part about being in a psychiatric hospital, that people actually read our notes, and that our notes need to be specific. We also need to tell our patients that we do write a note, and sometimes we write them together as we end the conversation. But anyway, Brandon, I wanted to see what your thoughts were as you think back on that patient.
I know we're at the end. I'll be brief. That's a good way to end, but I'll try to code that a bit. I think that we all, as you're alluding to, Paul and Angelika, we all fall so easily into saying about a particular symptom or an aspect of experience, this is psychological and not spiritual, or this is spiritual and not psychiatric. So yes, both and. We all recognize those binaries as unhelpful, but we do collapse into them easily as systems and clinicians and patients too. So I think that this is a shining example where a chaplain who was very curious and motivated to actually learn a great deal about a specific, in this case, borderline personality disorder, came away with building an incredible relationship to that patient's, I would say, kind of nascent, regrowing, revitalizing spiritual and religious aspects of her experience without any minimization or failure to appreciate what was going on that would be traditionally understood more clinically around how some of those behaviors were communicating interpersonally and to self. And I think Angelika just blended those sides together. And that quality of curiosity that she highlighted is the number one thing I see in her when we work together and share a case. It's what we see in our CPE students who come and work on these units, that capacity to just keep asking those questions and not worry so much about what's what, but actually how can we get to a holistic understanding of as many parts as we can hold together with our patients and help them hold them themselves without us ultimately. So yeah, I'll end there.
And
That was
just to say,
awesome. Go ahead,
yeah,
Angelika.
just briefly to say, a lot of people ask me about the slides. The slides are actually fairly close to the paper. So if you want to just check out the paper and read it, it's open access, it's available to you. Please go right ahead.
Jasmine, any last words from you before I hit end event?
No, outside of this is a wonderful way to celebrate Spiritual Care Week. So thank you all so much for being here, and special thank you to our panelists.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much
friends.
for
Thank you.
having us. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.